All right, it's 10:05, so we'll get started here. Hi, everybody. My name is Rachel Portinga, and I'm the Network Coordinator for the Lake Superior Living Labs Network. We're super excited that everyone's here today, and I just wanted to, I know some of us spend all day on Zoom, and some of us maybe don't. So I just wanted to run through a few things on how to work Zoom. We have a couple of requests as well. So we're going to use the chat box quite a bit today. So go ahead and pull that up. That'll be a great place to ask questions. We have also set up this Zoom meeting so that you can unmute yourself. So if during this discussion period, especially with Julian, if you would like to verbally ask a question, go ahead and raise your hand. You can do that by clicking on participants in the bottom bar, and when you move your mouse, that appears. And then under participants, you'll have a raise your hand option. You can also write in the chat, I'd like to ask a question, and that lets us know too. So those are the two ways during this first session in particular that we'll be doing questions. We are recording the session this morning and then a couple of the sessions this afternoon. So if you would like your face to not be in that recording, go ahead and turn your video off. Otherwise, while others are presenting, please make sure you're muted. And finally, we would love to have the initials of your town at the front of your name if possible. So for example, you'll see that mine says TB, which is not for tuberculosis, but is rather for Thunder Bay. So if you could rename yourself, if you hover your mouse over the picture of yourself on Zoom, you'll see three little dots in a blue button. And if you click on that, the third option should be rename. And then if you click on rename, you can go ahead and add a D for Duluth, or an SSM for Sault Ste. Marie, an H for Houghton, Michigan, and a TB for Thunder Bay. If none of those apply to you, please go ahead and throw in your state, your province, your town. I will let you decide what's best for you there. So if you're comfortable with that, renaming yourself is beautiful, so we know where you're located. And I think at this point, I'll be over here doing some tech things and admitting people and things like that. So if you do have any tech questions, please feel free to either send them to myself in the chat privately or to Shadia, who is also helping out on tech today. So thanks. Charles, go ahead.
Great. Rachel, thank you very much. And I just want to also say welcome, everybody, to our first Lake Superior Living Labs Network Summit, which was intended to be not virtual, but so is the time. And we're going to try to make this work. And we've scheduled a whole range of things that will hopefully make being on Zoom for a bit of time more than just staring at a screen. So yeah, we'll talk about that in a moment. But I just want to say I put up the save the date slide just because it is a gorgeous picture of in Lake Superior Provincial Park. For those of you who have had the beautiful opportunity to be there, I thought it would help ground us a little bit as we start and bring us to this place. And with that, I want to also start off this summit by talking a bit about where we are and the land we're on. And to begin with, by really acknowledging the original custodians of this land and paying my respects to the elders, past, present, future, who hold the memories, the traditions, the cultures, and the hopes of Indigenous people. And the Lake Superior watershed, which we will be spending a lot of time talking about today, mostly in the afternoon, but hopefully this morning as well, is the traditional territory of many First Nations, tribal authorities, Indigenous communities, and this is not just a historical relationship, but a very current one and present one as well. So doing kind of land acknowledgements virtually is difficult because many of us are in different places, but I just want to name a few of the key places where most people in this that are present today are living today. So first, in Thunder Bay, I want to acknowledge and recognize that we're on traditional land of the Fort William First Nation, who are signatory to the Robinson-Superior Treaty of 1850, and also acknowledging the political representatives of Indigenous nations across Northern Ontario that reside and spend a lot of their time here in this city. The Anishinaabe Nation, Grand Council Treaty number 3, the Anishinaabe Nation, and a number of independent First Nations. And our region here is also home to many Métis historical settlements. So in Sault Ste. Marie, as moving around the lake, also known as Baoting, I want to acknowledge that we're also on the land of Robinson Huron Treaty territory, that the land is the traditional territory of Anishinaabe, home to the Garden River First Nation and Batchewana First Nation and Métis Nation as well. And moving around the lake to our other main hub in Duluth, I want to acknowledge that we're on traditional, ancestral, and contemporary lands of Ojibwe people. Before them, the Dakota and the Northern Kayan people and other Native peoples from time immemorial. And that land was ceded by the Ojibwe in an 1854 treaty, but the land holds great historical, spiritual, personal significance for its original stewards, Native nations and peoples of the region who are still very much there today. And I just want to say that I think land acknowledgements are, at least here in Canada, are not just about enacting the calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which we have been asked to do. But starting with the land acknowledgement, I think is really important because it helps to ground us in this place and to begin our summit by acknowledging the context in which we work every day, in which we live. It also helps us to acknowledge and to move us towards the idea that justice and equity is really an essential part of sustainability. And that's very much what we're going to be talking about this morning. And I think until we meaningfully address our colonial past and our settler colonial present, that we really will not be able to achieve sustainability. And that's a big part of what we're going to be talking about this morning. So with that, before we get into the nitty gritty as part of our opening, I want to invite Shadia Adid, who is a wonderful spoken word poet and has been part of much of our work in the region here, is going to offer us some words to get started.
Thank you, Charles. Yeah, thank you for the introduction. I wanted to share a poem to open up this space. This poem talks a little bit about how environmental harms exacerbate inequality, and yeah, I thought I would share it. So yeah, let me just get into it. Okay. Natural disasters are the way our Earth protects herself. She fights back by dancing and shaking the herd away, drowning her inhabitants to sink the pain they've caused, burning the creatures who've pillaged her fruits. Oh, how beautiful she is. Man-made disasters are mistakes, like when you forget to charge your phone, like when you forget your keys and no one's home, simply accidents that weren't intended. If it weren't for that one guy, your life could have been defended, but now you just gotta accept it. Natural or man-made disasters can't be contained. But say that to someone who's on the verge of death. A disaster is approaching, you're getting breathless, you're in the middle of a scene and there's nowhere you can't be seen, so you start to scream. But no one will remember your name. You're just a casualty for economic gain. A useless pawn in this classist game. Your pain goes unnoticed. Unfocused, we see the stats and that's just it. No justice, you see the news and just mute it because all it tells you is 300,000 died during hurricane, 10,000 died during drought, 5,000 died during explosion, died during, thousands died enduring, because mothers had babies that they couldn't abandon, because aid came much later and most were left stranded, because the levees weren't held up, because safety checks weren't checked, due to lack of funds. Seems like it's all just for fun. Consider these natural disasters are natural, therefore these natural disasters are naturally racist, classist, sexist, ageist. They are the most talented of artists. Katrina laid down her canvas and spotted red on a Black population. The Asian tsunami danced over the Pacific and drowned Asians. The earthquake in Haiti rumbled like a percussion and killed Haitians. The poor bodies, the brown, Black, and indigenous bodies, the female and the elder bodies die first, and they die the worst. They can't escape that way that politicians left their states. They can't change the moral compass industrial corporations face their fate. All they can do is point their compass to blame innocent individuals who weren't properly trained, machinery that was not properly maintained. See, natural disasters point to the naturally unupheld state of society. If you tell people to leave a city before an ensuing storm, don't they need a car to miss the downpour? If you tell people that the chemicals they are working with are deadly, but don't offer another job, do you think they'll just leave? If you build a shoddy house near the shore and the only ones the community can afford, will they have a home to come back to? All I'm left to do is to question these natural incidents, these unfortunate mistakes. That's all.
Shadi, thank you so much for sharing not just your words, but some of your wisdom with us as well. I think those words are not just fun to listen to, but I think really like are very very meaningful for the work we're doing, and kind of I was something for us to all consider and think about as we kind of move through the rest of the day. So thank you so much for that. While I'm thanking a few people, I just want to name the steering committee who of the Lake Superior Living Labs who have been kind of instrumental in getting this network going and getting some of the work happening, and you'll be meeting them throughout the day. In Duluth, we have Randy Hansen and Catherine Millen, and then in Sault Ste. Marie, Naren Cameron, and here in Thunder Bay, Lindsay Galway. And I should probably introduce myself too, for those who don't know me. I'm Charles Levko. I live in Thunder Bay right now. I'm a professor at Lakehead University, Canada Research Chair in Sustainable Food Systems. And I've had the really great pleasure of kind of working with all these wonderful people over the last little bit, getting this kind of network off the ground. And also thank you, I'm not going to name them all, but there are a bunch of graduate assistants, students, graduate students who you'll meet throughout the day who are going to be taking notes and helping with some of the details of the summit. Shadia is one of them who is going to be helping with some of the tech, and you'll be meeting her again later when she's going to help facilitate some of the summit. And of course, just to Social Science Humanities Research Council, who is the main funder of this summit so far, although lots of other supports coming in from other places. And of course, Lakehead University, University of Minnesota Duluth, Lake Superior College, Algoma University, and all of our community partners who have been so instrumental in kind of bringing us all together. So before we jump into the discussion part, I wanted to just take a moment to just give you a brief overview of the schedule for today and the plan. And I know some of you, well, a number of you who are joined today have been part of the Lake Superior Living Labs network. I know some of you haven't. So I just wanted to take a few minutes to just give you kind of an overview of the network. So, we can all kind of go into the next part of the summit with some common understanding of what we're doing here. So first off, in terms of the agenda, as soon as I finish up, I'm going to turn it over to actually Shadia, who's going to moderate the discussion. Well, actually, I'll introduce Julian Ajiman, who is going to give us a very short kind of opening, and then we are hoping to have a discussion, which Shadia has agreed to moderate. And again, so as you're listening to Julian, as you're kind of thinking through some of your own work, this is really intended to be a discussion, not a lecture. So we're really going to try that out, and we have some hopes of how that's going to work. After that, we'll probably break for lunch sometime around 12:30 or 11:30. Sorry, 12. We'll see. We're kind of a bit flexible. We'll see how long it goes. And then we'll take a lunch break, and Rachel will explain. We're going to leave the Zoom open if folks want to be part of a lunchtime discussion. And then after lunch around 1 o'clock, we're going to have some very short hub presentations, so you can hear a bit about what's been going on in Duluth, in Thunder Bay, and in Sault Ste. Marie in respect to the work that the Lake Superior Living Labs network has been involved with. And then we're going to do some breakout rooms, and it's going to be a chance for those of you who can stay. We have some questions, which again, we'll talk about later soon, which you actually should have received by email, which we're going to just have some time to kind of connect with each other and talk, and then we will wrap everything up by 3 o'clock. And I know that there are some people who are not able to stay for the whole thing, and there are some people who are only joining in the afternoon. So You will see numbers kind of rise and fall throughout the day. But for those of you who can stay, thanks very much for being here. So, Rachel, did I miss anything for the, okay, I'm seeing a note. Great. Okay, so let me give you, I want to just give you a very brief overview of the Lake Superior Living Labs Network because as I said, I know some of you have not been connected to it thus far. And maybe I'll just start with telling you a little short story, which is that when I came to Thunder Bay, this region, about, I guess it was been almost 4.5 years ago now. I didn't know, I had been through here as a kid. I didn't know much about it. And coming here, I was just kind of overwhelmed with both many of the challenges that were being faced in this region, but also a lot of the wonderful people, wonderful projects, amazing communities that were really critically thinking about how to address those issues and how to do things better. And one of the things that really struck me was that I would talk to one person over here, and then I'd talk to someone else, and I was down and doing some work in Batchewana First Nations and talking to people there, and ended up in Duluth for a few events and talking to people there. And I was really amazed and surprised at how little we were all talking to each other about this work. And as I had more conversations and got to know people better, the idea of building a bit of a network or a platform for us to start to connect with each other about some of the issues and challenges we're having, but also about opportunities and ways to connect and ways to work more closely together seemed not just, it wasn't my idea, it was an idea that everyone had. And so this idea of the Lake Superior Living Labs Network was kind of birthed as that kind of platform for some of this work to happen and have more collaboration. So let me just tell you then really this idea of the Lake Superior Living Labs Network was founded on the idea that some of these ecological impacts of humans on the earth are really some of the most pressing challenges of our generation. And whether that's climate change, soil degradation, water and air pollution, deforestation, the effects on human and ecological health are really ones that are going to affect all life on the planet. And in the Lake Superior watershed, we're seeing some concerns that are common to other places, but also some very unique concerns because of where we are, whether that's species extinction, loss of biodiversity, declining human health and well-being, and of course, increasing inequality. And I think it's important to say that these issues that we're facing here don't affect us all in the same way. So at one level, we're all in it together, but not all in the same way. And here, I think we really need to recognize and act on the issues of inequity underlying the way we have structured society. And we can really see that in some of the ecological impacts in this region. So we really felt that post-secondary institutions and community groups are really in a unique position to address some of these justice and sustainability goals in this rapidly changing world. And across the global north, we saw these ideas of living laboratories as ways of integrating research, teaching, community engagement to advance kind of regenerative social and ecological systems. And that really is the idea of a living lab, to integrate kind of models of sustainability through interdisciplinary, place-based experiential learning and action in the built and natural environments. So while many post-secondary institutions, community-based organizations in the Lake Superior watershed are already engaged in all kinds of amazing sustainability-related projects, we really felt that, and we feel that more collaboration is going to lead to more systemic and impacting solutions by sharing some of our experiences and establishing opportunities for synergy. So the Lake Superior Living Labs Network, to sum it up, is really trying to work with new and existing academic and community partners to increase our impacts of sustainability-related teaching, research, and action with a focus on this kind of nexus. I'll just go back. This is our kind of nexus diagram of issues surrounding food, water, and land, climate, energy, and individual community well-being, and really with this idea of just sustainabilities, which we're going to be talking more about today, at the core of what we want to do. So Right now, we have kind of three main hubs, as I mentioned already, in Thunder Bay, in Duluth, at Algoma University, in Sault Ste. Marie. And we've been having some really exciting conversations with a number of community-based organizations, First Nations, Indigenous communities, tribal authorities across the Lake Superior watershed, about kind of integrating more into the work we're doing and us integrating into their work more. And specifically, folks at Michigan Tech, who I know there's a number of people here today in Houghton, which may very soon become a fourth hub to this network. So good things to come. I'm just going to show you this last slide. So obviously we have a website where we're trying to post a lot of the stuff, and the recording from today will be on there as well. These logos are more the original partners. Our community has expanded since then, but it is in the process journey we're all part of. So with that, that's my overview of the network. Of course, there's more you can see, more you can learn on the website, which is livinglabsnetwork.org. With that, I want to turn to the next part of our agenda, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen. There we go. So I want to begin by introducing Julian Agyeman, Dr. Julian Agyeman, and then I will turn over to Shadia. So I'll just tell you, for those of you who don't know him, and it's amazing, I'm really glad he could be here. I have known about Julian's work for many, many years, and I think, Julian, we met for the first time in person in Exeter at the Royal Geographer Society. You and I were in a session together. I think we sat beside each other and we got chatting after, and the rest is history. But Julian, for those of you who don't know, is a professor of urban environmental policy and planning at Tufts University. He's one of the originator of the increasingly influential concept of just sustainabilities, which is the intentional integration of social justice, environmental sustainability, which we'll be talking more about today. And I hope many of you had the chance to watch the video that we posted as a kind of precursor to this discussion. Julian's work really centers on critical explorations of complex and embedded relations between humans and the urban environment, whether mediated by government or social movement organizations, and their effects on public policy and planning process and outcomes, particularly in relation to notions of justice and equity. He has authored 12 books, or edited 12 books, one being Just Sustainabilities, Development in an Unequal World. The other one I just want to mention, because it's a book I use all the time in my teaching and my own research, Cultivating Food Justice, Race, Class, and Sustainability, which was published in 2011, which I always feel like in some ways it was published way too late. We needed that book a long time before that. But it's also a book that was way ahead of its time, because we can pick it up now, almost 10 years later, and it is, everything in there is as relevant, as important as it was, and maybe more important in a lot of ways today. I guess Shadia, am I turning it over to you now, or should I turn it over to Julian? Okay, so I'm going to turn over to Julian. I think, Julian, you had a short intro, and then Shadia is going to take over, and she'll let you know how we're going to do our discussion. So Julian, welcome.
Thanks, Charles. Thank you for the network for inviting me, and I'm always happy to do these presentations. I'd like to just acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from Wampanoag and Massachusetts unceded territories in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I'd like to pay respects to the past, present, and future of those two peoples. And I think we should remember that last month it was 400 years since the Mayflower arrived from England and was met by the Wampanoag people on the shores of Massachusetts, what is now Massachusetts. What I want to do is, I mean, ordinarily I'd give a presentation, but Charles assures me that you've all studiously watched my presentation. Hi, Connie. I just want to give a shout out to Connie Russell. Connie and I go back a long, long way, back when we were kind of junior scholars and environmental educators. We're still junior, aren't we, Connie?
Sure, we were youngins. There's no gray now.
We're youngins. We're a little bit grayer, but we're wiser. We're wiser.
Yes.
I hope. what I want to do is just pull out a few of the key concepts that I hope you took away from the recorded presentation. So, just sustainabilities, why? There still is, and there was 20 years ago, an equity deficit, what I call an equity deficit in most sustainability discourse, writing, and in practice. You could go then, and you can go now, to websites and look at sustainability projects. They are mostly environmental still. That has to change for all the reasons Charles gave you, and for the stunning realities of today. I mean, I get emails now from my ex-students who sat in my Just Sustainabilities class 20 years ago, and they said, Julian, it was interesting then, it is so necessary now. Every day goes by and I realize that issues of sustainability are so inextricably linked to issues of social justice, because think about, you know, anywhere around the world where environmental degradation is happening, it's almost always, in fact, it's always linked to questions of social injustice and human rights violations, whether it's in the Niger Delta, the Amazon, the Kamchatka Peninsula, or whether it's in First Nations communities in Canada, African American or Native American communities in the United States. Social injustice and environmental injustice are linked in very, very strong ways. Other points that I really want you to think about are now I work in urban planning now, and I'm very taken with the definition of urban planning as managing our coexistence in shared space. It is all you need to know about why we need urban planning. We need to coexist in shared spaces. But we are not all the same, and coexisting in shared spaces in cities and communities of difference is a challenge, but it's also a great opportunity for contact, for understanding, for intercultural learning. I also want us to think about the concepts of belonging and becoming. I'm increasingly interested in this, and if anybody's interested, I've just written a paper with Janice Barry from the University of Waterloo about settler colonial theory, belonging and becoming, and how settler colonial theory is not used much in urban planning in the United States. I'm one of very few professors in urban planning who routinely gives an acknowledgement of the land, who on his email has a land recognition. This needs to spread more and more in the United States. We do not recognize, in ways that you do in Canada, on whose land we stand. I'm not saying you're perfect, and I know you would say it's not perfect, but recognition has to be a first step towards reconciliation and towards some form of co-produced futurities. So this idea of belonging and becoming, we are so good in sustainability networks, in urban planning, in environmentalism, in dreaming of what we can become. But let's not forget, we are denying belonging. We are denying recognition. We are denying difference, diversity, equity, inclusion. I want to see just sustainabilities as a way of thinking about, yes, dreaming about what we can become, but we can only become who we allow to belong. And if we don't allow belonging to a lot of people, low income, minority, First Nations, then we are just going to be becoming increasingly elite dreamers. That can't continue. I want us to think as well about our organizations. Does your organization look like the community it serves? If not, are you legitimate? Are you trusted? Are you even effective at doing what you want to do? Yesterday, I was on a call with an organization down in Roanoke. I can't even remember which state that is now. Is it one of the Carolinas? Anyway, it's the usual thing. Julian, we want to increase our outreach. And I critique the word outreach. What is outreach? Outreach is, hey, we want more diversity, howsoever defined, in our projects. It's nothing to do with increasing power in lower income minority communities. Outreach is a settler colonial concept. You know, now I'm not saying that the people who do outreach or the organizations that want to do outreach are necessarily bad. They're not. But we need to purge our language of words like outreach, blight, placemaking. What is placemaking? It's place taking. It's saying to somebody, your place actually isn't quite good enough and we're going to make it better. We need to think about the vocabulary of sustainability, of urban planning, of networks like yours. Let's think about the words you use very carefully, because they are mostly pejorative and they are in the interests of maintaining white supremacy. So in this discussion, I mean, I just want to really open up to you and be of use for the next hour or so, and help you think through some of the issues that you're going to be facing in the network. You know, whether it's my work in food, whether it's my work in the sharing cities idea, whether it's more general about just sustainabilities, whether it's about urban design and urban planning. I'm open to your questions, and I hear I have an excellent moderator in Shadia. So your reputation precedes you, Shadia. You know this. So
Oh, you're so kind. Thank you.
would you like? Yeah. Take it away.
Yeah, no problem. First thing, thank you so much for the great introduction. I think what we'll do is we're going to have a discussion. We'll have questions come in multiple ways. One of those ways can be through the chat box, so you can ask a question directly into there. If you want to remain anonymous, you can message me privately and I can share that question as well. And then the other way that you can also ask a question is verbally. So how you would do that is when you go at the bottom where participants are, if it's not already open, and then at the bottom of that, there's the raise hand feature. So either of those options work. If you can't access the raise hand feature, you can just say, I want to speak in the chat box, and you can share your question that way too. I really encourage everyone to share questions, but also comments, responses to other people's discussions or questions would also be very welcome. So yeah, let's just get started.
Shadia, I think Connie was going to ask a question.
Yeah, I can jump in. I actually tried to raise my little hand in the participants thing and I was having problems with my computer. So Julian, it is wonderful to see you. It's been so long and I've been a fan of your work, and my goodness, I still make students read your Minding the Gap article from a gazillion years ago in environmental education research. So I've got a question. As you know, I'm really interested in coalitional politics and solidarity. And many of the organizations that I've been involved with have had issues around racism, classism, sexism, right? We know how, you know, these forces are present in, you know, many NGOs and organizations. And so I've got sort of two questions for you. One is ways in which you may have found ways of bringing groups together that works. And then my other question is about pushing beyond the human, because I noticed that you were talking in your talk about inequality and who is recognized, and clearly other animals tend not to be. And so I wondered if posthumanism has had any influence on your work, and how you could imagine just sustainability's pushing beyond the human in recognition that so many animal groups have huge problems with racism, classism, sexism.
Well, thanks, Connie. Absolutely. So, yeah, two really good questions there. And let me take the first one first, the sort of coalition notion. In one of my books, Sustainable Communities and the Challenge of Environmental Justice, I looked at an organization in Boston called ACE, Alternatives for Community and Environment. Really amazing environmental justice organization. And what struck me was that the organization itself was a coalition. the largely people of color in the organization were the community organizers, were the people out in the communities, whereas the empowered people, often with degrees, higher degrees, were in the office raising lots of money, getting pro bono legal work, blah, blah, blah. It worked. So the organization itself was a Just Sustainabilities Coalition, a multicultural coalition. And it worked because everybody, and I observed staff meetings for months, everybody had an equal right to speak. Nobody's voice was privileged above. You know, the MIT PhD was not privileged above the person who'd been to Bunker Hill Community College. It worked. And another sort of coalition that I studied as part of this was a coalition that ACE itself had set up called Clean Buses for Boston. So this was a coalition between social justice, housing, worker rights organizations, and then the Audubon Society, the Sierra Club joined in, the Conservation Law Foundation, these very well-heeled, largely white, but very progressive organizations. So you had this coalition around Clean Buses for Boston. And the brilliance of it was, of course, that everybody wanted clean buses for Boston. The dirty diesels, as we called them, were polluting largely the inner urban communities of Roxbury, Dorchester in Boston. And what was really amazing, though, it was a school kid project run by the Roxbury Environmental Empowerment Program. Get that, not environmental education, environmental empowerment program. These kids did some monitoring and they found that the buses in the local bus garage were breaking Massachusetts law in the summer by idling for longer than 5 minutes. So this was generated by largely kids of color in an inner urban neighborhood. The issue was then taken up by ACE and this Just Sustainabilities, this coalition of you know, sort of largely white privileged groups and largely black and poor inner urban groups formed around Clean Buses for Boston. What's the point? The point is we can have, let's look at achievable things that we can agree on. We're never going to have ideological confluence, perhaps, but I did think in those days, 15 years ago, that perhaps by just working together, by the notion of contact theory, that these groups working together would learn something about each other, about their strategies, their organizing, their ideologies. But, you know, but ideological confluence wasn't important. It was about getting something done. And the then Republican governor of Massachusetts, who later actually became ambassador to Canada, Paul Cellucci, he signed an agreement with the MBTA, the Massachusetts Bay Transit Authority, that to get rid of these buses. The EPA punished the MBTA, and we had, in those days, 200 compressed natural gas buses on the streets of Boston as a result of young black kids monitoring and using Massachusetts law to their advantage. So, Connie, you know, I think we can see in organizations the potential for coalitions, but the key point is everybody's equal. You must flatten the hierarchies, everybody's voice is respected. And so I likened ACE to a Robin Hood organization. So basically, the empowered people in the organization were getting shed loads of money from downtown Boston law firms, pro bono time. They were bringing it into the community, and then it was being spent, if you like, by the community workers who were going. So there was an escalator of money and influence coming from downtown Boston into these neighborhoods when it wouldn't ordinarily have happened. And so that was, you know, one level. And then, of course, the Clean Buses for Boston coalition was just a winner from the start. Who's going to say we don't want clean buses in Boston? But the beauty of it was that those clean buses disproportionately benefited those kids in urban, in inner urban Boston, in Roxbury and Dorchester, where asthma levels, get this, are 5 times the rate of the rest of Massachusetts. So Coalition building, I think, can happen at the organizational level, but it can also happen at the project level as well. So I would urge you guys to think of what are the commonalities that you could all agree on across political divides. And I'm reminded here as well of the German Greens. Remember the German Greens? In the late 1980s, the German Greens held the balance of power in Germany. They were incredibly powerful and they were very clever. They said, we're neither right nor left, we're just ahead. And in many ways, I like that. Let's get away from the binary politics. We're neither right nor left, we're just ahead. And I think just sustainability's thinking is ahead thinking in many ways. To your second point, Connie, you touched my Achilles heel. My good friend David Schlossberg at University of Sydney, he's an American, but he's at University of Sydney, has written a lot on sort of what he calls ecological justice, which brings in exactly what you're talking about. I have to say it is an area that I need to think about. It's an area that I do need to do more work on. I have been, I think, unashamedly in many ways anthropocentric in a lot of my environmental justice and just sustainability's kind of work. Although now, I mean, if you see the new love in my life, this is my chocolate lab, Oso. Oso means bear in Spanish because he's like a little bear. I am beginning to understand more about the animal kingdom as a result of him coming into my life 2 years ago. But Connie, let's talk further on that, because I love some readings. I'd love to get into that. It definitely is an area that I can say, you know, mea culpa. It's just not something that I've done so much research on.
Well, that's such an awesome response to both questions. I was really inspired by your examples, particularly the ways in which, you know, Black youth sort of sparked that. That's just, you know, I'm going to see if I can find, I'll look for your writing on that, because that might be something I could share with my environmental education students. Okay. And then the animal or post-human question, you know, yeah, we all have, you know, I sort of think of us as spotlighting on particular issues, and that's why collaboration is so important. And it's tricky. I don't, you know, multi-species ethnography, it's hard to think about how we can do this, but yeah, I'd love to have a private conversation with you sometime about that.
Absolutely. But Connie, just so the book is Sustainable Communities and the Challenge of Environmental Justice.
Okay, perfect.
And especially there's one particular chapter in there on alternatives for community and environment, where really we look at the history of this. And what's really interesting as well, I emphasized that the group, the subgroup of ACE was called the Roxbury Environmental Empowerment Program, not environmental education. And I do offer a few words of thought about that. Education is not sufficient in those neighborhoods. It has to be about environmental empowerment. And the result was clear to see that these kids, you know, said, hey, we're really worried about asthma in our neighborhood. We need to do something about it. And they went and measured. They worked with various universities. So it was a ground up discovery, if you like.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Julian.
Thank you, Connie, for your question. For those of you that have just joined, we're taking questions, discussion, comments to Dr. Agerman, and feel free to post in the chat box if you have any questions, to raise your hand, or to communicate a question or a response. So we have Lindsay, who has wanted you to speak about sustainable communities and the challenge of environmental justice.
Oh, sorry, that was just the title of the book and a link to the book if anyone's interested in that. But I could share a question while I'm talking anyways. So Julian, I've been, you know, following your work for some time too. And so I come from a public health perspective where we actually do often a good job, I think, thinking about equity and thinking about social determinants in health and those forms of things. But one of the things I did want to ask you about, and in following some of your work and your reading, one of the things that drew me to just sustainabilities is actually the plural that you use in sustainabilities. I've always really liked that because I think just in that, and as you were telling us before, words are tools, right? Words can affect change in how we use our words. But I wanted to hear from you a little bit about why you thought it was important to include that plural. It can make it a little clumsy to say or to write about sometimes, but I really appreciate it. So I wanted to hear your perspective on why it is important to.
Absolutely, but can I just go to your your first point about how people in the public health realm have been, I think, and I agree with you, better on issues of equity and social justice. I wrote a paper 2012 on cultural competency, cultural humility in urban planning, and the fact that if you look at urban health professionals, social workers, they both have the need for cultural competency in their codes of ethics, whereas urban planners, who after all are interacting with communities, there's no mention of cultural competency. And why is this? Urban planners, from the days of the 60s with equity planning and, these ideas of equity and social justice have been around, but they've never ventured into the area of cultural competency, cultural humility. And I did find a really amazing paper that said, public health, medical outcomes increase as a result of culturally competent healthcare. And I posited the question, well, what about urban planning outcomes? If we had culturally competent urban planning, would we have better urban planning outcomes? And I think the answer has got to be yes. So just to back up what you're saying, Lindsay, I think it's, you guys in public health have done a much better job than environmentalists, for instance. So to your question, yes, just sustainability. It does annoy me when people still say, oh, Julian talks about just sustainability. That sounds prescriptive. It sounds as if there's one cookie cutter method of moving toward a more just sustainability. But we recognize that, there are certain principles, that we must commit to improving the quality of life and well-being. We must do that now and into the future, into an intra-generational equity. We must recognize the rights to be, and we must live within ecosystem limits. Those are immutable, but we really did recognize that sustainability will look different in different cultural and relational contexts. So that was why, and that's why I always use the plural, just sustainabilities. As many people now don't talk about urbanism, they talk about urbanisms. So absolutely, the plural is a recognition, a very explicit recognition that, although there are certain principles, the concept is still a very relational, culturally located concept.
Wonderful. Does anyone have any other questions to share? Please don't be shy. This is a safe space and we want to hear a broad range of perspectives. I think, Kristen, please go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Sorry, I was trying to raise my hand. I didn't see the hand appear, but maybe I guess you saw something that I didn't.
It's there, yeah.
Okay, all right, I didn't see it. So thank you, so much for that great introduction. And I think, I've read, some of your work to various degrees, and I'm really, I've tried to begin kind of engaging more in my own sort of research with this idea of kind of merging sort of justice and sustainability. And I think, I'm now in an environmental studies school, and I think there's still a lot of these things are often not thought about together. We have a module on environmental justice in our first year class, and then, we continue to proceed with a lot of the class with talking about environmental issues, right? So I think there's a lot of work to be done to really integrate these ideas more systematically. But my question was, I guess I was thinking about these ideas of becoming and belonging and becoming. And so you talk about a bit about recognition. And then there was also, I'm just wondering if you could speak at all about, are there the limitations of recognition? And I think you mentioned in that article that, you pointed us to earlier around settler colonialism and urban planning about the politics of refusal as well. So what's the relationship here between, is it just about recognition, or is there also a space for not just wanting to be recognized by a group, but perhaps pushing towards perhaps a different type of participation, I guess?
Yeah, absolutely. Great questions. I just want to go back to your environmental studies point, because you know, our first Just Sustainabilities book, Just Sustainabilities Development in an Unequal World, which really opened up the concept, you know, in the, I think I say it in the particular recording that you saw, but that book, every chapter looked at equity and social justice through the lens of whatever particular issue the author was talking about. Too many books, there is the, oh, who are we going to get to write the justice chapter? Oh, Julian can do it. You know, you have no idea how many refusals I give now, because people just want to tick off justice and relegate it to one chapter, just as in your course, Kristin, I am assuming that, you know, oh, well, we do justice. Yeah, it's the environmental justice class. Well, what if you don't take the environmental justice class? And this brings me to a bigger point that I think I finished the conversation in that video with. We need to center environmental justice, social justice. We don't get to them. I spent a year at McGill in Montreal, fabulous year, love Montreal. It was a year's sabbatical, and the students had never heard urban planning in the way that I talked about it. And one of them said, you know, I'm in an urban design class, and in the first class we asked the professor, when are we going to get to talk about equity and social justice? And he said, oh, equity, social justice, we'll get to that eventually. And I'm going to write a book called Equity, Social Justice, We'll Get to That, because it is the way a lot of people think about it. What they do is they think about getting the technical aspects, the environmental aspects, the economic aspects of policy. And then if it leads to greater social justice and equity, all well and good. So equity and social justice are often implicit. I want you to think of them as explicit. And in an environmental studies course, they should be part of the core curriculum rather than in an optional class, as I'm assuming it is. Going on to your point about, you know, I talk about recognition as a precursor. It's the first rung on the ladder, a precursor to other forms of interaction. You know, whether it's the Black Lives Matter movement in the US, whether it's First Nations issues in Canada, you know, simple recognition, it seems to me, is a first step. It's not the end. It's not a side. It is, you know, a first and very important step. Now, we've had a big debate at Tufts University because I've tried to start this notion that we need recognition on our website. I was very impressed with a lot of Canadian universities. Right up front on the landing page, they will have a land recognition statement. I had to dig about 10 or 15 minutes at Tufts, and it wasn't on the official website. It was in a Tufts Daily article written by some students 5 years ago. So we don't even recognize that the hill on which our administration buildings is built is a former Massachusetts slave farm, and B, that it was prior to that Wampanoag land. We don't recognize that. How can we begin to, and maybe I'm talking also from a position in the United States where we are way behind you in Canada in thinking about these issues. We are way behind. It is not routine when I go to a conference in the US to hear a welcome to the land. I go to Australia, I go to New Zealand. It is always there. In fact, some Australians and New Zealanders and maybe some Canadians say, well, it's got a bit routine these days. People just reel it off, and it's, you know, we need to move on. And some of our First Nations students at Tufts that I've spoken to have said, you know, well, Julian, the land recognition statement, it's one thing, but. So absolutely, Kristen, we're at a very difficult point here. But I think for us in the United States, just getting to recognition is a really important thing. You guys in Canada, I think you're a bit further on, the Australians, the New Zealanders, but you know, help us just to get to recognition in the US, and that's a big thing. Hope that helps.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you. I appreciate that. I think I was thinking about, yeah, recognition and maybe and then if you know the ways in which are there limits to recognition in terms of simply wanting to be recognized within kind of a particular existing political order, but then the need to maybe challenge that or refuse, right, and mobilize as well, right? So I was just thinking about this kind of relationship. Yeah,
absolutely. And I just see someone, Michigan Tech only puts it on our Center for Diversity and Inclusion page. See, this is the thing. And maybe this is a danger of recognition, that recognition is categorized into diversity and inclusion rather than recognition across the whole institution, across the whole curriculum. We're very good at siloing these issues into parts of the curriculum where only the keen students will take the environmental justice class. And it's probably not those students like you, Kristen, who took the environmental justice class. It's probably the other students who didn't take it that really need to think about it. So let's think about the dangers of compartmentalizing recognition into one particular part of the curriculum or a particular part of the website. Actually, the person who wrote that about Michigan Tech, can they just speak to that for a second?
I think they had to hop off the call for another meeting, unfortunately.
Okay.
Yeah, they had to leave the call. They might be back. I will point to Asima to go next. Can I unmute yourself?
Thanks very much.
And yeah.
Good morning, Julian. My name is Asma Vez, and I'm the president of Algoma University. Really enjoying this discussion this morning. And I'm not sure how much you know about Algoma University, probably a little bit, but we are on the former site of a residential school and have a very close connection to the land and to Indigenous people, particularly in this area, and which is Ojibwe. The question that's sort of resonating with me right now, as we work with our Indigenous partners, and as we sort of think about as a university where we want to go in terms of environmental sciences, environmental studies, but also what we want graduates today to be thinking about and to leave Algoma with. And one of the things that's been sitting with me lately as I learn more about the teachings of the Indigenous people, and when I think about social and environmental justice, weaving Indigenous knowledge into the curriculum so that our students are getting deep understanding and access to those teachings, connected with the land and the Indigenous knowledge base. So what I'm thinking of right now, one of those really important teachings is the teachings around 7 generations. So really what we do today really, really matters, right? Because every decision we make today can have impact on our children, our grandchildren, our great-great-grandchildren. And the Indigenous people really do look at decision-making for the environment and for land in that way. And when we think of what's happening today around policy making, decisions that are being making politically, environmentally, I think if we can graduate students with some of this knowledge, I mean, there's a whole piece here too around the spirituality of the Indigenous people as well, and of other cultures, quite frankly, around the world, where they look at living things universally, right? So everything is interconnected. And, the Ojibwe people in this area, they call every living thing a relative. that we're actually interconnected and interrelated. And so when we cut down a forest, for example, right, we need to understand that these are our relatives. And so to be, and I'm not saying that you can't cut down the forest, and I don't think our chief would say that either, or some of our chiefs, but you better be really understanding why you're doing that and what the impact is to your relatives, and then take responsibility for what happens next, right? So I'm just wondering if you've spent some time thinking the land acknowledgements are important, but understanding what comes behind that land acknowledgement and the sustainability practices and the stewardship that comes along with making that statement, I think is a really important part of this discussion.
Absolutely. Well, you know, Seema, I've just put in the chat a recent piece from The Conversation, which I think is an excellent source. I love its kind of its strapline is academic rigor, journalistic flair, and I've put in a piece from an author who talks about you know, indigenizing the curriculum, and they cite a Canadian scholar, and I'm blanking on her name at the moment. Actually, let me just find it. Marlene Brandt Castellano, Canadian Mohawk scholar. Indigenizing education means that every subject at every level is examined to consider how and to what extent current content and pedagogy reflect the presence of Indigenous peoples and the valid contributions of Indigenous knowledge. And this, you know, they focus here on the University of Tasmania that has really doing this in many, you know, across the curriculum. How do we indigenize the curriculum? And, you know, like my response to one of the earlier questioners, you know, recognition is literally the first mini step that we can take. And you're absolutely right. Behind that is a whole world of concepts, a whole constellation of ideas and practices that we need to think about. And it's, you know, it's part of decentering a white supremacist settler colonial mindset, which is basically what our curriculum is organized around. I'm teaching a class this semester. Every fall I teach my food justice critical approaches in policy and planning class, and you know, that's about, you know, decentering this largely white imagined food system and thinking about Indigenous ways, thinking about even nutritional advice. The great thing about this this class that I teach, it's cross-listed with our Tufts Friedman School of Nutrition Science and Policy. So I get a lot of agriculture, nutrition students, and they are blown away because they don't, nutrition is not a critical subject. They don't do critical approaches. There's this handed down notion about nutrition, these molecules that we all need. They don't understand that they are embodying a whole range of supremacist ideas in nutrition, in body shape, in all kinds of ways. And so absolutely, Seema, I mean, I would love to talk to you more about this and about, you know, what comes next after recognition. What are they? I mean, there's not a linear sequence, clearly. I mean, but there's a whole opening after this. But again, I do emphasize the point that at US universities, and some are better than others, I think, but at most US universities, they're only just beginning to think about land recognition. And if that's the first place we need to go, then let's go there. But, you know, you and I know that there is, you know, and then they'll cherry pick. I mean, you know, a lot of kind of sustainability advocates will talk about, you know, the seventh generation ideas. People will cherry pick Indigenous ideas, Indigenous crop systems. But I tweeted out a piece recently where an Indigenous scholar was saying, don't just take my ideas about Indigenous crop systems. You're doing me no favors. You know, this comes from a worldview. It's located in a worldview that you need to understand if you want to use my ideas about Indigenous cropping. So I think you're absolutely right. There's a framework that needs to be adopted to locate these practices, whether it's Indigenous cropping systems, whether it's kind of 7 generations thinking. Thank you for reminding us of that.
Thank you. Yeah, I think I definitely agree around the aspect around acknowledgement and recognition being incredibly important, because, yeah, in some organizations and some groups fail at that to begin with, but also that, you know, I think something like an acknowledgement, or I think what Mark was saying around it being a statement in of a portfolio or on a website, it can seem performative, you know, at times. It can be akin to like a black square during the BLM, you know, like it can be something that is there more performatively if these groups are not doing that internal work of decolonization, or and you know, actually enacting anti-racist policies and making their groups equitable. But yeah, I think it's a really cool discussion to think about what comes next after that, and what is enough, and what progress goes there. I think Catherine, I believe, came in, had a question. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. Hi, Julian. So I'm Catherine Millen. I'm in Duluth, and I wanted to ask you about this recognition empowerment combination, in particular with reference to property. So we know that holding property and that kind of empowerment that has, and I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about interesting workarounds or ownership property strategies that you found that have attached empowerment to recognition. And I'm going to just 2 quick examples that I can think of that from here, that, you know, in the 1980s here, you know, the White Earth Land Settlement Act, you know, when it won in the court, what they had to do was buy back property for the tribe around, so that they could govern in a way that the land could be, you know, they could buy up these pockets that of the Boy Scouts, you know, club and various other things that had split up the land. So that was one strategy, buying back property. Or the agrarian trust movement, in order to, you know, hold land so that the, you know, other types of farmers can come in and be there. So what kinds of strategies that with regard to property and workarounds of dominant property forms are you aware of that combine recognition and empowerment?
Well, you know, I literally really focus on urban environments. And so I've looked at things like community land trusts, which have been used a lot in Boston. And especially, well, in fact, let me tell you about one particular organization, because I mentioned earlier the importance of, well, in fact, this is another form of recognition. Before the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative set itself up in the early 1980s, and I urge you to go to the website, dsni.org, it's one of the finest examples of a non-profit, I think, in the US. It's been running for 40 years. So in the early 80s, they set this organization up as a response to disinvestment, to dereliction, you know, as a result of redlining, you know, racist covenants, all of the nasty things we know that went on and still in some form go on in US cities. But so the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative, before constituting themselves, they did a demographic survey of the neighborhood. Cape Verdeans, Haitians, Jamaicans, they looked at all the different nationalities and they constituted the board of directors to look like the community. Today, 2 community land trust and urban farm sites later, one of which is a for-profit farm, 900 units of affordable housing, the Dudley Commons. 40 years later, they are an amazing organization that are seen as very legitimate. They're the only non-profit in the US that has ever been given eminent domain status. I mean, eminent domain status is amazing, you know, in terms of your question. They are loved by funders, and 40 years on, they are still going. There's lots of, if you dig on their website, there's books been written about them. There's some excellent videos from the 90s and into the 2000s about this organization. It, I think, is an amazing case study that you could at least devote 1 or 2 classes to if you're teaching, really looking at community organizing, coalition building, the recognition of land deprivation, the cooperative nature of holding land in community land trust. So that, I would say, is a great example. I am, though, getting increasingly interested, although I wrote a piece for the conversation on the rise again in cooperatives amongst African Americans. Remember, after slavery, African Americans couldn't get farms, couldn't get land, couldn't get anything. And Jessica Nembhard Wilson, I think it is, wrote an amazing book on how really African Americans reinvigorated the cooperative movement, because cooperation was necessary when other forms of economic enterprise were not open to them. So there's a strong link between recognition, land, cooperatives, and all of this, of course, happens as we now know, that something like 80% of African American farmers have disappeared since the early 20th century. So against that backdrop, there's now a resurgence in interest in notions of cooperative farming, specifically amongst African American farmers. I hope that can be of use to you, but do look into dsni.org, the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative.
Yeah, thank you so much, Julian. I know that so many people are looking for examples of community land trusts that are stable and progressive in that way. So thank you. That's great. I didn't know about that.
There's a really good example in Seattle, and again, this was in the conversation. I do urge you to read the conversation. There was an example of the city of Seattle was decommissioning a fire station, and it gave the land and the building to the local African American community as community land trust land, and it's now going to be repurposed. So I think there's a lot of potential, and I see Charles has put my land loss that has plagued Black American farmers piece in. Yeah, if you can also find this, I mean, Google Seattle fire station becomes community land trust. Again, an inspirational piece about what can be done, especially in urban environments, through the community land trust model. And, you know, it's not just, you know, workspaces or maker spaces. It can be used for urban farming, because as we know, urban farming often happens on that land that people think, oh, what the hell are we going to do with this? And often that land then becomes, you know, it gets bought by a property developer and something gets put on it. Well, community land trust land is land in perpetuity, or at least 99 years.
Wonderful. Next, we'll have Phoebe Ann ask a question.
Hi, Julian. Thanks so much for joining us, and loved your pre-talk as well. So just thinking about, I guess for me, this recognition piece, and I should say my background is in critical disability studies and math studies. So I'm coming from that perspective, and I'm curious how you see critical disability perspectives fitting with just sustainabilities, because thinking about recognition, I think disability perspectives frequently get left out of conversations about sustainability or the environmental movement. And, you know, it's an important question, both because unjust environments can be disabling, like I'm thinking about the mercury poisoning in grassy narrows, for example. but then also, disabled folks are frequently either ignored within conversations about environmental sustainability or, treated as disposable in environmental movements where there's kind of a regressive anti-technology bent sometimes, the back to the land kind of thing. But where does that leave a lot of disabled folks who rely on many technologies, like the technologies we're using today, for example, as one of many examples. So it's my rambling approach to my question of how do you see disability justice fitting in with just sustainabilities? Thanks.
Yeah, great question, Phoebe-Ann. I must put you in contact with a PhD researcher in the UK who's looking at precisely the issues you're looking at, issues of disability and sustainability. While I haven't done specific research on issues of disability and just sustainabilities, the framework of just sustainabilities, of course, is an enabling framework which I think needs working through from a disabilities perspective, and this particular PhD researcher in the UK is doing just that. So I'm going to be very interested. In fact, I mean, if somebody wants to Google, PhD UK, disability and environmental justice or just sustainabilities, you might find her research. I met her at I think American Association of Geographers conference. So let me give you just something that's been made me think a lot recently. Angela Glover Blackwell, who was the director and founder of PolicyLink in the US, she wrote an amazing piece called The Curb Cut Effect. And she was talking specifically about the precursor to the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and about how curb cuts didn't just benefit people with mobility disabilities, but they benefited, parents with strollers. They benefited, people pulling these now ubiquitous luggage trolleys. They benefited delivery workers. So she invokes this idea of the curb cut effect, where if we do policy making that is about equity, increasing equity, it actually benefits everybody, in addition to focusing on the group that is the main beneficiary of this. And again, if somebody can just Google Angela Glover Blackwell curb cut effect, there is a fabulous piece. I can't even remember whether it's in the Atlantic magazine or whether it's a standalone policy brief, but it is really, really, really worth reading, because I think if we can embed this principle. Now, Phoebe-Ann, you might say, but hang on, are we diluting the message by saying, hey, it's not just good for disabled people or people with disabilities, it's good for everybody. Therefore, policymakers are going to think, yeah, let's do it because we get maximum bang for our buck. I don't see it as that, but I could see it could be a legitimate reaction from people, in or with various forms of disability. Yeah, Charles has just found it, the curb cut effect. I urge you to read it. As a policy principle, I think it works along this line, that equity planning for whether it's disability, whether it's planning for various issues that are not seen as mainstream, that everybody does benefit, because it makes us think about issues of access. I heard about one Scandinavian university where architecture and planning students have to spend a week in a wheelchair. What a great thing to do, to have urban planners understanding. And as somebody who's played wheelchair basketball against people who are really in wheelchairs, I learned that the term disability is, again, words have consequences. These kids ran rings around us who were sitting in wheelchairs just to play against them. They ran rings around us, and it was humbling to realize just how able-body centric we can be. And I think urban planners, architects, urban designers should spend time with simulated disabilities to actually even perceive, recognize that there are different ways of moving through the urban environment. Shadow a person of color. One of the things that was interesting for me in Montreal, and I say this to you Canadians, and I hope you're not going to dislike me for it, but I do find when I come north of the border, a lot of Canadians will say, so there's this liberal Canadian kind of notion, we're not racist in Canada. And then I say, well, follow me for a day, follow me for a day. And then the conversation goes further. And then the last gasp of Canadian liberalism is, it's not as bad as it is in the United States. And that's, and I say, well, that's not a very high bar to hold. That's not a very high bar to hold. But I illustrate, I do this, Fabian, just to illustrate difference and diversity. We live in cities of difference, and that's not just racial and ethnic. That is difference in ability and disability, difference in so many ways. And so my point at the beginning about how do we coexist in shared spaces where difference and diversity is increasing, and how do we benefit from that rather than always seeing it as a deficit? But I will find you a link to this person. I think you'd probably be interested in some of the work that she's doing.
Great, thanks for that, Julian. I think, I just would want to caution a little bit around, using a mobility device for a couple of days is not the same as living in a disabled body, of course. And so I think just like you were talking about in your pre-talk about the importance of community or people who live in an area being involved in urban planning processes. I think that's also true of making sure people with disabilities, disabled people, are included in those processes too, right? Because you are going to miss things even if you're trying to simulate. It's not the same thing. But I hadn't heard about the curb cut effect. That sounds interesting. And I think it parallels a lot what a lot of folks in the disability community are saying right now about, have been told for decades, oh, it's just too hard to include you virtually or to create technologies of access. And then once COVID happened and affected everybody, it's like all of a sudden everybody can work remotely. Well, how about that? So absolutely, things that benefit the disabled community to benefit everyone. And, for almost all of us, ability is a temporary condition anyway, if we stick around long enough. So.
Yeah. Thanks, Fabian, for that. And again, I go back to this notion of recognition, this notion of spending architecture or urban planning, urban design, city building students spending a week in a wheelchair. It is in no way a reflection of inhabiting a body with a specified disability, but again, I think it leads to a recognition. It is life-changing. My memory of playing wheelchair basketball is a life-changing memory. I can remember what I felt as I was fumbling around trying to play basketball, basically. Yeah, thank you.
Wonderful questions. Next, I'll have David go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
Hey, Julian. I'm Dave from Sault Ste. Marie. I'm a big fan of Boston. I just wanted to touch on something that's going on in our community for the last few years. We had a major planning process called Future Sault Ste. Marie. We were envisioning what a future Sault Ste. Marie would look and feel like, and it did uncover a lot of interesting things around social inequity in our community, but also about inclusion as well of Indigenous peoples. And since that time, I believe the city has really woken up to a lot of these things, and with organizations in the city itself, through planning measures, have put in plans for a new plaza that would bring people together for a spatially unjust neighborhood, to do a lot of improvements there. But I think one thing that's kind of missing is the living with the ecosystem limits of One Planet Living. In parallel to this, our community has planned a ferrochrome smelter, and there's a lot of opposition to it. I mean, it's going to create stainless steel. I've got a chef knife and I've got a barbecue, but I don't feel our community needs this, and many don't. I'm just wondering, like, in your research, have you found other communities where there's a lot of contradictions in terms of what is planned through the design of the city, but also this inability to recognize environmental degradation on our doorstep? Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, this is very common, David. It's a great example. Yes, absolutely. You know, there are times, again, as I think you identify here, where the social justice issues are increasingly being acknowledged, but then they're almost being traded off against, okay, well, we need more jobs, so we got to put this thing in our community. And, you know, it's really interesting because I've got a friend who's, I mean, you know, the environmental justice movement initially looked at toxic dumping, the presence of unwanted land uses in low-income minority neighborhoods. And, you know, so this friend of mine is doing some research on the justice implications of carbon capture technologies. Where is the carbon, in whatever form, where is it going to be dumped? And, you know, is a new environmental justice frontier going to be created from these new technologies that are doing good by capturing carbon? I mean, I think we're in for an interesting ride. Let me, at the most optimistic, it's going to be an interesting ride in terms of some of these carbon capture technologies. There's going to be a lot of jobs, and we're going to have to do some of these new carbon technologies, which I don't know that much about. But I mean, I'm assuming, in Sault Ste. Marie, I mean, you know, you've lost a lot of business. I mean, you used to be are you still a huge grain port? I'm remembering my A-level geography now from 1977, so I might be a little bit dated.
That's more Thunder Bay is a grain hub. In the Sioux, it's been steel and pulp making for much of its history, still is. But yes, we did lose a lot of employment in the 80s, 90s around those industries.
And so let me ask, I mean, how are the city council framing? I mean, you know, everybody's doing these 2020. I just spoke recently at Cleveland 2020, Sustainable Cleveland 2020. Everybody's doing these, you know, the Minneapolis 2040 plan. Again, it's all about becoming, but, you know, many of them are thinking about belonging. But it seems to me that your city seems to be going against public opinion with this.
It would seem that way. Yeah, I would agree. I know that there's other organizations in the communities and other faculty, universities that have much differing views on this subject. And with COVID, it can be difficult to have these conversations as well. I feel that, you know, they may have not happened to the best of what they could in the consultation with the main company that's seeking to do this, but also with our city.
But how are they how is the city framing this? You know, you're going through this futures imaginary. How is the city framing putting this land use in? Is it framing it the usual way? Jobs, is that what it is?
Yeah, it's framing that it would be good for jobs. There's also been, you know, some research into how other countries, like in Scandinavia, have been running their smelters. Comparisons of what it could do environmentally here as well. And there's a process, right? It's a long, arduous process through Indigenous consultation, provincial regulations. But it seems like since March, it's been maybe less at the forefront as it has, yeah, for sure, because it isn't approved yet.
Yeah, no, I think, this is one of the great challenges is, and especially in places like you're in, it is a great challenge. I mean, in Massachusetts, we do have some similar issues with nuclear power stations in certain communities on the Massachusetts coast. We've had some reaction about wind farms off Cape Cod. But they're largely different communities, like the Kennedys, who don't want to see the wind farm, from their compound in Hyannis. So, different industries, different forms of response. But if you can send me a link, I'd be interested to see how this dichotomy is happening between, an acknowledgement of the need for greater social justice, and yet, environmentally problematic options look like they're going to happen or are starting to go through the permitting process.
Yes, I think someone just put a link in the chat there from Jody. Thanks, Jody.
Wonderful. I will move on to Charles. Please go ahead and ask some questions.
Right, thanks. I know we're kind of winding down soon, but I wanted to get a question, and it's been a really great discussion, and a lot of the things I was thinking about have already been asked in different ways. So I want to ask a question that I think builds on a little bit of what's already been said, but I want to ask it more directly. And I've just been thinking a bit about, as the land acknowledgement piece came up, and I've been thinking about the politics of recognition. And, Julian, while I very much agree that, land acknowledgements are important in the first, but they are, as you said, the first step on a ladder. And, we have Truth and Reconciliation Commission that happened here a number of years ago. And, as I mentioned at the beginning, naming, acknowledging was a call to action. It was one of the things we've been asked to do. So we do it, and a lot of people do it. But as you alluded to, and others have, it has become a bit of a moral safety valve, I would argue, in that, we do our land acknowledgements, and then we move on to talk about things like urban development or extractionism or a whole range of issues that not just ignore the importance of the land we're on, but, actually counteract it or contradict it. So I'm thinking about, so I'm getting to my question here. I'm thinking about the issues of just sustainability and spatial equity that you discussed in the video. And I guess my question is really about how, if you have any thoughts, because this is something I've been struggling with, is how do conceptions of spatial equity apply to Indigenous people and Indigenous communities? And the question for me comes from a place of, and this is in no way to kind of create any kind of hierarchy of oppression. I don't believe we should ever be doing that. But Indigenous people and Indigenous communities are different than other equity-seeking groups. I think they are the first people. This was and still is in many cases Indigenous land. And it's more, and this goes back to almost something that Phoebe Ann mentioned, it's more than just inclusion or creating Indigenous serving spaces or culturally relevant spaces. But like, what does, I guess, beyond kind of returning land, which is what really is being asked for in a lot of ways, what does it mean to have kind of equity or spatial equity? And again, that's something that I think around the Lake Superior watershed, we're all real, like that's a real, I mean, it's a reality everywhere. Let's be clear, but it is something that, in Thunder Bay, where we have the largest percentage of per capita Indigenous community in the country, like it is something that is very real and present here on a daily basis. And I think should be everywhere again. But so it's a question that I think is really at the back of my mind as we've been having this whole.
Charles, it sounds like you're setting up the question for the rest of the conference and the rest of the afternoon. I mean, it's a and I would love to learn from you. I mean, look, to be brutally honest, I'm at the beginning of my journey on this. you know, simultaneously learning as well as trying to, and you know, the best have been my students. A lot of them are now, and other faculty members are now, you know, taking the land recognition statements that I put on my emails, and increasing numbers of students, etc. excuse me, are doing this. You know, I think it goes back to Catherine's question about land. And look, we essentially have at least two mentalities. We have, you know, the pre-settlement mentality of stewardship, and now a settler colonial mentality that has been imposed over that of ownership. You know, and it's the same as when the British settlers went to Australia and declared terra nullius. Well, you know, we have at least two different worldviews about how land should be looked after, if you want. One is a more reverential and spiritual link with the land. The other is a more extractive, exploitative, and individualistic approach to land. And, you know, so the great geographer David Harvey said, you know, when he was talking about gentrification, he said, we're building cities for people to invest in, not to live in. And what an important point. Whether it's the glass towers in Vancouver that are half empty, or Boston, or London, or Toronto, or anywhere in the world, we've changed our cities to investment hubs rather than places for people to live in. And in many ways, the corollary with the land is open there. I mean, we could see that the land was about a place to live and be and not to own, but now we've become obsessed with ownership. And until we can either reconcile these two polar opposite worldviews, I'm not sure that there is a chance of any form of reconciliation that is going to be meaningful. And I think that's, you know, again, that's something. Let's work on this. I'm, you know, again, I'm at the beginning of my thinking on a lot of this. And I did send a link to my piece, which is for free download from a new journal called Race, Ethnicity and the City, edited by somebody from the University of Tacoma and University College London. And it's, so, I mean, take a look at that. You know, this is a beginning of a journey, I think, for a lot of us thinking about that. But I do think we have this real clash of worldviews, and I'm not sure how that is going to, how that can pan out. You know, is there a halfway between point? I'm not sure. I welcome anybody's thought on that, Charles. And I mean, obviously, you've been thinking about this. Well, Jacob Randall.
Yeah, when you talk about the halfway points and the steps towards incorporating some of these mindsets, a lot of your talk has been the importance of establishments integrating these social considerations, this equity into their operations. But many of the successes that you've also talked about have really been founded with these considerations in place, whether that be DSNI or in your talks at some of the farming community. And today I'm representing Thunder Bay, which is often a case study of the problems with settler colonial mindsets in Canada, despite the work of many of the people on this call. But as establishments are working to integrate these better considerations to work to improve this, their past relationships and their foundations that were created with settler colonial mindsets in mind are an obstacle. Where do you see the balance as we try and enact this change going forward between adapting our existing establishments to incorporate this, to integrate this? And how much do you see things having to be recreated with this as a foundation?
Well, Jacob, you very cleverly asked a question when I was asking you a question, but I actually do want to go there, but I also want to hear what Randall has to say. But so
I
look,
apologize.
no, absolutely. Look, you know, I've been thinking a lot about notions of interculturalism as opposed to multiculturalism. Multiculturalism celebrates diversity. Interculturalism looks towards a more pluralistic transformation of our civic space, institutions, etc., etc. And I look at the city of Boston now, a majority minority city, but still the boardrooms, the power bases in Boston are still full of largely white men. But good news is we are going to have our first woman of color mayoral candidate, and I think she's got a really, really good chance of winning. Do Google her, Michelle Wu. On Tuesday, I sat on a panel looking at her fantastic food justice agenda. It is by far, and Charles, you might have seen on the Food Planning Network, I sent a copy of it out. It is a revolutionary for a US city. This is not like the Seattle Food Action Plan or the Toronto. This is a food justice agenda originated not by a non-profit, but by a city, by an aspiring mayor. It is by far. Anyway, my point here, Jacob, is how do we embed, and when I say intercultural, I'm talking about, you know, in your case, with First Nations, with all the differences and diversity, how do we embed that intercultural notion into the decision-making institutions, rather than just creating little landmarks and pastiche spaces? How do we embed this? How do we do it in Boston? Because that, to me, seems like the beginning of what might be a new co-produced reality. And I would leave it then to those people to think about how we reconcile this stewardship versus ownership conundrum, which of course is at the heart of much of the research and the practice that we're all interested in. I've got to go in a few minutes, but I want to just get Randall. Randall was interested in giving a response to this.
Well, actually, I had a question for you, Julian.
It's all about questions, Randall, isn't it?
I'm messing with your flow here.
Okay, don't worry.
Thank you for all the work that you've done. You know, that Just Sustainability's book had such an impact on so many people, including me. And you know, I wanted to ask you about that framework against sort of the backdrop of some recent developments in our city, which is experiencing many of the things that we've talked about in terms of, you know, extractionism for hundreds of years, really. But more recently, Duluth has been touted as a space of climate refugee arrivalism, as it were. And, you know, that our city is going to become sort of a magnet for climate refugees from the interdesert West, the Southwest, the Southeast, and so forth. In addition to that, you know, more recently, the unrest in Minneapolis in particular, but sort of all over the United States around racial justice and the impatience and the, issues around that has kind of made Duluth a potential site for white flight from Minneapolis. And so, you know, at this moment where we're struggling with many of the issues that so many people have talked about today in terms of how to create just sustainabilities around food and energy and water, we're also becoming a poster child and a practical space for underscoring the divides that have long scripted America. And how does the framework of just sustainabilities help us sort of frame and build coalitions and public understanding of those issues?
Well, it's a great question. And, you know, funnily enough, Randall, I remember reading somewhere about Duluth and this, you know, you know, I don't know whether it was modelers who'd done it or whatever, but Duluth was exactly as you say, you know, becoming a kind of hub. And I was reading about people moving out of LA, San Francisco, Seattle, going to Bozeman, Montana.
For wealthier people.
For wealthy
right?
people, yeah. And then, you know, poorer people were going to Billings, Montana. You know, Portland, Maine is off the charts for Bostonians, New Yorkers. You know, I mean, small town America, I think, is coming back big time. But you know, I mean, let's not think about the people coming in. Let's think about the price of rentals, property prices, the gentrification that is going to happen, because, you know, these people are coming from, you know, if you're coming from LA, and you've had a home for 20 years, you can probably drop $1 million, $2 million in cash for places, you know, and it's going to skew property markets, rental markets. You know, where are the, you know, the workers going to live in these settlements? Your city is going to experience this, and, you know, there will be winners and losers. The restaurants, the hotel chains, some of the stores that will come in following these people. We are about to witness a major spatial reshift, if you like, a repatterning of America. You know, and you know, if it were just COVID, that would be one thing, but you mentioned, Randall, white flight again. You know, we had white flight in the 40s and 50s, and then white folks are coming back to cities. There's a chapter in one of my books, and the title of the chapter is a quote from an elderly African-American man sitting in the front of a house in West Oakland. And he says, someday the white folks are going to want these homes again. And I just, you know, I nearly cry every time I think about that. You know, he used to live there, and he recognizes, though, he has no agency. He is part of a pawn in this supremacist, wealthy choice that a lot of white folks have. Hey, it's not safe here. We're going to move elsewhere. Let's go west. Let's do whatever. Randall, we never configured just sustainabilities knowing 20 years on that we were going to be facing not one but two mobility generating crises, COVID and race. And ain't nothing going to scare Americans more than those two. I mean, let's face that. You know, that this is an issue. And actually, I don't think we're talking about it nearly enough. I think at the moment it's a trickle. But I think if this goes on, and if, you know, I can't even bring myself to say it, but if something happens on November the 3rd, hey, Canadians, give me a job, please. I'll come and, yeah, I'll come to Canada, because I can't go back to Britain. You know, they're in total deep doo-doos. But Randall, I take your point. The Just Sustainabilities framework is a caring framework, it's an empathetic framework, but it's not focused on this idea of migration of largely wealthy people. But I'd be interested to know what the discourse is in Duluth at the moment. How are people feeling about this? Because this is not, you know, this is not the usual migrants. Immigrants to places are often from another country. They're often poorer than the average person. But what you're probably going to experience is wealthy immigrants, but who are white. Right. So that's a different dynamic, isn't it?
Right. Well, and this is something that Joseph and who's here and a whole bunch of others have been, and Catherine, with a sort of longer term reading group that we've had, and you know, kind of around these questions. But you know, it was this sort of real estate scholar from Harvard who actually has written several pieces on this. And because Duluth was mentioned in the name, several sort of academic administrators from the University of Minnesota Duluth sort of tabbed him to come, and it became the kind of framework for sustainability, believe it or not, by sort of a science centered and engineering centered administration. And for our mayor, it became, wow, this is a great form of economic development.
Well, you see, this is the winner and loser concept, isn't it? I mean, you think to a mayor of a town like yours that's had really mixed fortunes, and you're going to get an influx of wealthy white folks, you know, who are going to pay cash for their homes, probably. And let me guess, property prices are, you know, pretty reasonable in Detroit compared to San Francisco, Seattle, New York, Boston, any of the major metropolitan areas. These folks are probably going to be highly educated folks as well. I mean, you know, the mayor is probably thinking, you know, property tax dollars, all the home improvements that are going to go on. Yeah, I mean, we are so much at the beginning of this that it's hard to predict what scenario will actually play out. But it's a fascinating one. And it's doubly fascinating, as we say, because, you know, when we talk about climate refugees, we often think of North Africans coming to Europe, to Italy, to Greece in those inflatable boats, dying en route, the Greek Navy, the Italian Navy, you know, being, let's say, slow to pick up some of the, you know, we often think of brown bodies as climate refugees. Well, what about wealthy white bodies as climate refugees? That's a, you know, that's another level to this rapidly unfolding chapter in human history.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to have to go in a couple of minutes because I got to, you know, see some students at around 12. But, you know, Charles, keep me in the loop with all of these discussions. Randall, and any of you, please send me information about a lot of these discussions, because, again, you know, we're on a journey. This, you know, I say this to my students: sustainability isn't a destination; it's a journey. And I always say to my students, it's like you're going up a mountain and, you know, there's a bit of fog and you think you're at the summit, and then you see, oh my God, that's what I think a sustainable community is like. We will never actually get there because our definition of what a sustainable community is will be increasingly changed as we move towards sustainability. So it's the journey rather than the destination that I think we should be thinking about. And, you know, what that looks like in terms of, you know, the issues you've raised, Randall, Jacob, the issues you've raised, the issues you've all raised, it's going to be a very interesting journey. Maybe a few bumps along the way. A lot of bumps along the way.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Julian, for the lively discussion, and thank you everyone for bringing really good perspectives to this discussion. I really appreciate also for you staying on a lot longer actually than you expected to hear us. And yeah, I really appreciate everyone's thoughts today. I will throw it to Charles just to close.
Yeah, I just want to echo Shadia's word. Thank you so much, Julian. We were a bit unsure how this was going to go, but clearly we shouldn't have been, because it was, you have lots to say, lots of people here have lots to say, and lots to talk about, lots to think about. And, you know, and I think again, as I said at the beginning, like the whole point of the Lake Superior Living Labs Network was to do this, to have spaces, platforms where we could have discussions, share what we're doing, push back on each other a little bit, and, in a kind of respectful way. And I think, we've done that now, and this is really great. This is what doing it in person, that'd be better, but so be it. This is where we are today. And yeah, and with that, I guess, Julie, I know you have to go. I do, before everyone leaves, I want to turn over to Rachel, who's just going to talk a little bit about what the plan for lunch is if people do want to stick around. This afternoon, as I mentioned, we are going to be talking more about some of the specific work happening in this region. And we're going to have lots of, some time for discussion as well, for everyone to kind of interact with each other a bit and get to know each other and continue some of this discussion.